Welcome back to Purrfect Takes. I'm your host, Stephen Patton, joined as always by my co-host and dear friend, Jacob McQuire. And today is the final episode before we get into mock drafts before the draft, which is in a little over a week. We are right around the corner. It is surprising to see the time from the Super Bowl to now fly by. And the position we're talking about, I think, is probably one of the more undervalued positions in football, probably since the 2011 CBA. And how I want to kick this off, Jacob, is who would you say are the two or three more dominant defensive linemen over the past decade or so, or a little bit more than a decade, since 2011, since the CBA, when rookie contracts have become extremely valuable? Who would you say are those game wreckers?
Well, you got to start with Aaron Donald, right?
Yep.
I think he's probably the best defender of his generation. He's up there. He could contend with being on the defensive Mount Rushmore. I think if you want to box J.J. Watt into a defensive lineman as opposed to an edge rusher, I think you got to throw him in there.
He played a lot of three-tech.
He did. When they had Clowney, who's on our roster, and Whitney Merciless, those early 2010s Texans years. And then you got to throw Chris Jones in there with the Chiefs. He's been a big reason why the Chiefs have been successful over their kind of window. And then you kind of get into like pick your poison kind of guys. Like Gerald McCoy isn't like a superstar by any means, but he had his run there. Geno Atkins had his run for a while too. KK Short with the Panthers had his run. But I think after the Aaron Donald and the Chris Jones and even the J.J. Watt, I think that's when it starts to tailor off into hall of very, very good players over the past, 14 or 15 seasons now.
Yeah, and that Hall of Very Good is an excellent kind of baseline to gauge a lot of the production from that position, and not just look at kind of the hierarchy or the top, the cream of the crop, so to speak. Yeah. But when you talk about Aaron Donald and J.J. Watt, it's honestly kind of hard to find an edge that even has that kind of production outside of like maybe a Myles Garrett or a Nick Bosa or a Micah Parsons. And what's interesting, outside of Nick Bosa, none of those guys have help their team get to the promised land. Whereas we've seen Aaron Donald help the Rams get to the Super Bowl. Chris Jones has been a part of the Chiefs' Super Bowl runs. And most recently, Jalen Carter with the Philadelphia Eagles, huge part of what they're doing. Again, another three-tech. And so I think when we talk about some of the better defensive tackles from this draft class and the prospects, a lot of these guys are three-techs. And so when we just talked about edge rushers last week, and those guys, a lot of them were developmental, where you're banking on this guy being a project, or he could project to being this superstar player. But just as we talked about, the superstar players we've seen on the defensive line have played on a more interior kind of basis and not that outside presence. So that's where I think our definition of value, or what we think is most important on the defensive line, I think needs to change a little bit, especially when we talk about some of these prospects who I think are extremely talented.
For sure. It's like edge rusher is the sexy position, right? Because that's who you see get around and make the crazy play, right? Because they have to do so much. It's flashy. But if you want to look at what's more important, interior pressure is what mostly causes disruption with the QB, right? That's where you see like bad throws, throwaways, hurries. It's usually from the interior, and it's forcing the QB wide to where the edge rushers can get those sacks. That's why when you see somebody like Aaron Donald get 20 plus sacks in his one of his defensive player of the year years, it's just so impressive, right? And last week we talked about the edge rushers being like different flavors, right, of ice cream. Well, the interior guys, that's like the main course of your meal, right? That's the hog mollies, the meat and potatoes, the things that are going to put in the work for your defensive line, while the ice cream on the outside, when you're done, it's tasty. You enjoy it. But you need to eat your vegetables. You need to eat the good stuff. And that's where the players in the trenches are going to be.
And to head right into the guys with the trenches, I think the best interior defensive line prospect, and I think this group is really close. It's not like last week when we talked about the edge rushers with Abdul Carter being a kind of notch above, or Jahad Campbell a tier or two above the other linebackers. With this class, it feels like the defensive tackles are a little bit closer, but with Mason Graham, I do feel like there is a floor that is there that I think is a little bit higher than the other prospects. And that is what a lot of people lean into. I love the wrestling background with him. This is a guy that plays with violent hands and just playing fundamentally sound, being a solid presence physically, not the biggest guy, but being big enough, I think is going to lend itself to being a very productive player at the next level.
Well, the guy we talked about to start this show, Aaron Donald, he wasn't the biggest guy either, right? He was actually an anomaly about how small he was. That's why he fell to like pick, I want to say pick 14 or 10 or something the year he was drafted out of Pitt to the Rams. And Mason Graham's the same way. He weighed at under 300 pounds for the combine. People report that his playing weight's a little bit more like 305, 310. So that shouldn't be too big of a concern. But he has the shorter arms too. But what that smaller size helps him do is shoot gaps quicker. Kind of like Kalijah Cansey a couple years ago out of Pitt as well. Smaller guy, but violent, disruptive, knows how to shed blockers, get upfield quick, fast, and in a hurry. And he doesn't have to sacrifice like his presence in the run game. He's not a bad run defender either, right? He's fundamental in taking care of maintaining his gaps, but also can get after the QB. And when you look at how Graham's been like the guy the past couple years at Michigan, not just this year when it's his final year, but last year when they went undefeated to win a national championship, he was the best player on that team. That was a team that had a quarterback get drafted in the top 10. So you really have to give Graham all the credit. I know we talk about how it's a little bit closer with the defensive tackle grouping, but I still think Graham is a cut above the rest. I actually gave him the same grade that I gave Abdul Carter, just because I think Graham is more refined for his position. And you mentioned his floor. I think his floor and ceiling are actually a little bit lower because of the size, but what he's put out on tape is just dominant. It's a display of force from the position. And if he makes it to pick 8 for the Panthers, that should be the pick. Where's the draft this year? It's in Green Bay, I want to say.
I think fly. It might be Chicago, but I'm not sure. It might have been Green Bay last year.
It was Chicago last year. It's Green Bay this year.
Oh, it's Green Bay this year. Okay.
I'll fly up to whatever airport Green Bay uses up in Wisconsin and run the card in myself if he makes it to pick 8. I doubt he will, though, with teams like Jacksonville that say their new GM says, hey, we need a dominant interior defensive lineman. That's Mason Graham to a T. The Raiders could use somebody to, even the Jets. And if he makes it past all those teams, I would love the pick for the Panthers. I just don't see him getting there.
It's funny that you say the Raiders, because I think he comps well to a Christian Wilkins, who they just signed to a big extension last offseason, the pair with Max Crosby and some of the other defensive linemen there. I think he would be a great addition there. You brought up a great point about kind of the lateral quickness, and he has a very explosive first step, and that lends itself to him being able to be effective in the run and the pass game. I think when you look at the measurables, that does kind of limit his ceiling as a player, like you said. And because of that, I think that's why I think the gap between him and some of the other guys is a little bit smaller. When you talk about a guy like Abdul Carter, like he's not necessarily the biggest guy, but there are things that he does from an athletic standpoint that really no one else is doing on the field. And I think that's what separates him in terms of that tiering. But I completely agree with you. Mason Graham is defensive tackle 1 in this class. But another guy who plays, I think, violently as well from the defensive tackle position. His play is a little bit more up and down, not as consistent as you like to see, but a highly recruited guy coming out of high school and now a first-round prospect coming out of college. What do you like out of Walter Nolan's game, and what do you dislike? I know I brought up levels of inconsistency, but are there other things that are kind of cluing you into why he might be a guy that's not highly as touted as some of these edge rushers that are being talked about in mock drafts?
Well, as far as knocks for Nolan, I think a lot of people in today's era, because we have NIL and the portal is very rampant in college football, I think still some scouts are still hung up on the idea that players want to transfer. You got to think this guy was the number 2 recruit in his class. You know who number 1 was in that class? If you want, they're in this draft class, so that should give you a hint.
So the number 1 prospect was actually, I'm not sure. Was it one of the offensive tackles?
It's the number 1 prospect in the draft. It's Travis Hunter was number 1 in that class. Walter Nolan was number 2, right? He commits to Jimbo Fisher at Texas A&M, but then Fisher gets fired, and all of a sudden, all these recruits who went to go play for a coach don't have that coach anymore. So it's only natural that they want to transfer out and go somewhere where they might up their stock. And I think a lot of people still get hung up on that. I'm not sure why. But you talk about his inconsistency. If you look at Walter Nolan's highs, like if you just watch his highlights, he's like pretty clearly the best player in this class. Like blows Mason Graham's highs out of the water, like much more disruptive than Abdul Carter. But then the lows are also pretty low, and you don't get the highs as often as you would like. You get the highs like 5 to 10 snaps a game instead of wanting a consistent 20 or a good 30 or something like that. It's very hit or miss. But and like looking at his positives, I think he is closer to Mason Graham than the rest of the defensive tackle group. In fact, on my board, it goes Travis Hunter, like in his own group, Ashton Genty, Abdul Carter, Mason Graham, and then Walter Nolan rounds out my top 5 because I believe in the upside that he brings. Undersized, just like my Mason Graham is, like just a hair under 300 pounds, plays the 3 tech as well on a disruptive defensive line like Graham did over his time there. Really good instincts. Like when he matches up against people and he hits, it's just over sometimes. I was watching tape with Will Campbell today for our Twitter series on like our top 15 prospects, and I posted one of the clips where Will Campbell got the better of Nolan, but then 2 plays later, Nolan from the outside just completely beats Will Campbell, one of the better tackles in the class. Really good tackler in the run game too. A lot of times you don't see big defensive linemen be able to tackle in space very well. Like usually they just like get an arm and wrap them up, but Walter Nolan can tackle well in space. I think he has like every like technical thing for his lower body, I think is good. I think he has a good anchor. Like he doesn't get driven off his spot, good footwork, all that kind of thing. He can be a pile pusher despite the small size. And I just think the upside is tantalizing. And if he can get to a spot where the defensive line coach can extract that upside on a more consistent basis, I think he's going to be one of the 3 to 5 most disruptive defensive tackles in our game. Like a spot like San Francisco, who usually they've had a great D line throughout the Shanahan tenure, and now it's kind of fallen into disarray because everybody's getting paid, or everybody's leaving, or they have to make money to pay a certain quarterback. I think if he goes, what are they, a pick 11, like right there, that'd be an excellent fit for him. Or like the Cardinals. Like the Cardinals, they've been doing work on their front in free agency, but I think that would be another excellent addition to a team that's trying to improve its defense. I think, and this is the last thing I'll say before I kick it to you, Walter Nolan seems to be falling a bit on mock drafts and on consensus and stuff. I would be willing to wager that he doesn't make it past like 23. I think he's going to go in the teens. I think the Packers are his floor as far as where he's going to go, but there's a ton of teams in the teens that could use defensive line help. The Falcons as well. The Falcons have been, since we've been alive, the Falcons have been a horrible like pass rushing team. I looked at it the other day, actually. Least sacks in the last 20 years the Falcons have had. So that'd be another good team. The Panthers, if they're convicted enough on taking him at 8, which we did host him for a 30 visit, that could be somebody that they're looking at there. But really, really good player. You just wish you could get more of those highs out of him on a down-to-down basis.
Dane Brugler put it best, that if you were to do a cut-up of this guy's 20 best plays from last season, he's a top 5 pick. Like, if you're judging simply based off those highs, it is absolutely insane, the ceiling. He's
the number 2 pick to me if you do that. Like, nobody's going to surpass Hunter, but Walter Nolan's highs are really good.
And when you look at high school and college production, he's in a tier and a quadrant with guys like Jalen Carter, Jeffrey Simmons, like studs, Aaron Donald even. Like, that's the tier and air he's getting mentioned with. And the highs are there because, like, when you talk about the explosion and just his ability to punch and just the power that comes from some of those punches, he's uprooted guards and just used them to tackle running backs. Like you said, it's not just the pass game. This guy can be violent in the run game. And to have a player with that capability, I'm sorry, I haven't seen those plays from Mikael Williams or Shamar Stewart, and everybody gushes about how big they are. Yes, Walter Nolan is undersized for a defensive lineman, but he's bigger than both of those guys. And if you have the opportunity as a Panthers team, and this is what I want to throw out there, because this is a deep edge class. It's not necessarily a deep defensive tackle class, because I think there is a drop after some of these like 4 or 5 guys that we're going to talk about today and kind of the rest of the group. But with a guy like Walter Nolan and Derek Brown playing kind of like your defensive ends, 3-tech in that 3-4 Evero system. And then you have Bobby Brown and Ashawn Robinson rotating as that nose tackle. Like that's ferocious because you're going to have consistency at two of those spots. And then if you're just waiting for one guy to blossom and kind of improve kind of his floor while still getting that upside, like that's tantalizing, especially with how much we got ran over last year. Like, I think that just raises the floor of that defensive unit so much and gives you those big plays that we're missing last year.
For sure. In the first mock draft I did for 2-point conversion, I had Mason Graham going 8th overall, and I echoed that sentiment, right? That if you could add Graham to a defensive line that's getting Derek Brown back, and then they signed Turk Wharton and Bobby Brown, and have Ashawn Robinson, Shai Tuttle just took a pay cut. Those are serious NFL fronts that you can rotate. We haven't had serious NFL fronts since the Super Bowl season.
Rivera.
I know the one year we signed Gerald McCoy, for like the first 4 games we had it, but then there was injuries throughout that season. That year was 2019 or 2020. We were competitive, but we also had Kyle Allen, so we couldn't win a lot of games there. As far as Nolan versus the 2 edge rushers you brought up, the first thing I'll say is all 3 of those guys played damn near the same position this past season because the Texas A&M and Georgia defensive coordinators needed to kick their edge rushers inside because they couldn't do it.
Like, and who was more productive out of those 3 players?
Nolan, because that's his position. So when I'll say, if I put let's say, I don't know, Malachi Starks at corner like we saw this year, you're gonna see some drop off because that's not what he's best at. As far as Shamar Stewart goes, I agree with you because even when he was rushing from the outside, he was just horribly inconsistent, couldn't finish plays. He could get into the backfield, couldn't finish plays. But with Michael Williams, I think there's a floor level of production you saw rushing from the outside that gives you hope and conviction that he can do that at a high level when he's not playing on a sprained ankle all year. As far as Shamar Stewart goes, I agree with you. And to that point, we are recording on Tuesday, April 15. Dan Morgan had a pop-up press conference today. I think it was largely to say we're open for business with the 8th pick, but he finished, or it was like the second to last question. He said, we're not going to draft people who weren't productive in college. So Shamar Stewart can kind of go out the window. I know we had a 30 visit on him, but that was probably to be like, well, does this guy have the upside we're looking for? And they were trying to see if that was the case. We also had a 30 visit for Walter Nolan. Maybe that's what they were looking for there. So I guess to wrap up Walter Nolan, I think he's definitely worth the look at 8, but I think as like when it comes to positional need, I think edge rusher is still a bigger need. I think there are better players that the team can convince themselves they can use early and to a greater effect than Nolan. So maybe that's the direction they lean in. But I think, to me, I told you how high I regard him. He's a top 5 player for me in this class. I wouldn't mind him being the pick at 8. I just I don't think he's going to make it there. And I think a lot of fans, just looking at consensus boards and stuff, would be upset with that pick. I don't think we should be if that's the direction the Panthers choose to go. I also don't think they should be upset with Michael Williams, but I said that on Thursday.
Yeah, and neither Mason Graham or Mikel Williams pick I'm going to be upset about. When I bring up Walter Nolan into the discussion with Mikel Williams is we haven't seen the numbers from Mikel Williams that we have from Walter Nolan his entire career since he's been on the scene. And so when that's his calling card and he's in a tier with some very, very elite defensive tackles. I mean, this is a guy that is putting up numbers with some of the best of them. This isn't like I don't want to put him in a tier with some of your like undersized guys, like a Nolan Smith, and he wasn't super productive coming out, but like where we talked about Mike Green and some of these other smaller edge rushers last week. I don't think he fits that criteria. He's big enough to play the position. It's just a matter of, can he be consistent down in and down out? And so when we talk about the next prospect, I think it's like the complete opposite, because with Derek Harmon, another 3-tech player, it's the level of consistency he does bring. And I think sometimes the biggest thing is just like Shamar Stewart, he can sometimes be a poor finisher. So that's where I think when you're looking at a guy where, hey, you want consistent play down in and down out with somebody that has tremendous upside, because again, he's a little bit bigger than the two guys we've talked about previously, and his production is really good. So those two things kind of put together, I think, are a really good indicator that that will translate well for Derek Harmon. He's a guy on a lot of draft analyst boards, and he is mocked in the first round. What are the glaring weaknesses for a player like him for you? Because for me, I don't see a lot of holes. It's just I don't necessarily see that tremendous upside with big play abilities, because again, I don't think he's finished and shown the disruptive nature that we see when the tape gets turned on.
Yeah, not a lot of glaring holes for me, like you're saying. I think level of consistency is something that he consistently brings. I didn't mean to say that. He's where do I have him? 33, I think. No, 32 on my board. So top 32 player for me. And I think when you talk about Derek Harmon, the first thing you got to mention is he's not undersized like the two guys we just talked about, and he can play 1 through 5. Like he can shade the inside of the center and play all the way out onto the tackle. So he brings a level of lineup versatility and like consistent play at each spot that you can like. I think he routinely commands double teams, especially in the run game. So if you already have like a disruptive, if you have a Walter Nolan already or a Mason Graham, I think Harmon would fit in really well with those kind of players. I guess the weaknesses I would say is the pass rush is hit or miss, right? Like he's consistent in, let's say, maintaining his gap and gapping, but it's like you're flipping a coin whether he gets into the backfield for a pressure or just kind of stands there. Like I think he needs to improve his finishing. We talked about that with Shamar Stewart, and that was a good comparison you brought up. Like I think Harmon can be disruptive, but he's not necessarily getting the QB on the ground or getting a tackle for loss in the backfield. He's just kind of breaking through the O-line and then having somebody else clean up the mess. If he improves in that area, I think that's why a lot of analysts have him super high, because if you can get into the backfield, you just have to be coached in order to finish, right? I think that's why people are higher on Shamar Stewart too. Like he has that level of athleticism. He can get there. He just needs to be able to finish. But when he does finish, it's impactful. I think Harmon's presence in the run game is quite good. I think he routinely collapses run lanes, making it hard for running backs and inside run schemes to operate. Like when you would watch Oregon, a lot of the stuff had to go outside. I think the noticeable difference between the first Ohio State game with them and the second was in the first game, Harmon was able to kind of clog that up and force Will Howard to bounce outside on his runs or go to a second read with his pressures. In the second Ohio State game, they just fried him because they could get stuff on the outside. They got Egbuka and Jeremiah Smith out in space. Travion Henderson was a menace in that game. But the first one, Oregon was able to contend. And a lot of it was due to Harmon being able to just, like anchor his spot, muddy his stuff up. And then from there, the rest of the defense did its part. But I think he can really, I think the number one thing for him is a high floor and a level of versatility. I think a lot of teams are going to like that because not a lot of teams might need a Mason Graham, right? Like let's take the Buccaneers, right? They probably don't need Mason Graham. And it's not because they have Vita Vea. It's because they have Kalijah Kancey. A lot of teams might not need a Walter Nolan, but a lot of teams need a defensive tackle or an interior defensive lineman. And that's what Derek Harmon can bring, being pretty consistent at a high level. I think the Penn State tape is his best tape if you need to convict yourself on him.
He's excellent at engaging and shedding blocks. To your point about being the run game, being sound and gap discipline. I think from a pass rush standpoint, even though that's not really his calling card right now, he's got an excellent bull rush and it pairs well with his size. I mean, we're talking about a guy that's 6'4", 322 pounds, 84th and 85th percentile respectively. And it's just impressive. This is a grown man that is displacing guys, is causing disruption. And I think all of that translates. And you pair him with maybe a team like where you brought up with the Buccaneers, where you do have a Vita Vea and a Kalijah Kancey, but you can have one or two of those guys off the field and he can kind of be there in rotation and fill one or both of their spots. And I think that versatility, like you said, lends itself to him kind of fitting in and really just kind of getting in a rotation seamlessly wherever he goes. So I think similarly where you said with Walter Nolan, he's a guy that's taken before, honestly, like pick 25. I think there are a lot of teams from like 18 to 24 that have defensive tackle needs. And so there could be a run there. And so we've talked about Mason Graham, who's probably top 10. I think Walter Nolan, like you said, could go in the teens. Derek Harmon, he could go in the 20s. And so I think the other guy who's actually mocked a little bit higher might actually be higher on your board. Personally, the guys that we've talked about, I think are a little bit better. And it may just be because I appreciate and value the 3 tech position a little bit more, but I think this is a good segue into Kenneth Grant, a true nose tackle at 340 pounds. He was the running mate with Mason Graham. You also had Josiah Stewart, who we talked about last Thursday. Really good defensive line. Do you think he was the guy that honestly benefited from those other two? Because when I was seeing some of the flaws in Kenneth Grant's game, despite his size, he struggled against double teams and didn't really anticipate like pullers and trap blockers that were coming. And just kind of those little nuances, given his size, kind of concerned me about his overall game.
Yes, I would say he was the one that benefited from Mason Graham, not the other way around. This was Grant's first year starting all I guess they played 12 games this year, or I think they made a bowl, 13. Starting all 13 games. The other years, they had some other players, right? I think his freshman year, they still had Mozzie Smith, and Mason Graham is a hard guy to displace. But first time starting, like you're talking about, a massive, massive player, a true nose tackle. I think he can play the 1 tech as well, like not necessarily lining up directly over the center, maybe on his outside shoulder, or I guess both of his shoulders are outside if he's the center and the ball's in the middle of him. But I agree with some of the stuff you're saying. I think he's quite stiff. And I know he made Bruce Feldman's freaks list, which is like the freak athletes, right, that are in college football. But I think at his size, the stiffness and not being able to change direction when chasing the ball carrier, pursuing the ball carrier are quite evident. I still think he needs to improve wrapping up as a tackler as well. Like you said, despite him commanding double teams, he didn't really when you talk about double teams, you want to have somebody who can hold them in place, right? Lock both of them up so one of them can't go combo another defensive lineman or a blitzer or something. And sometimes he couldn't do that. Like he would have the 2 people on him, but one of them could get off and work against a blitzer or go help on Mason Graham or something like that. You want to see him maintain a double team like that. But on the plus side, really good motor, right? Consistently fights throughout the play. I think he moves well vertically, like forward and backward for his size. He's never going to be a like Jihad Campbell, like going sideline to sideline because he's 340 pounds. But getting up and down, getting vertical, I think he's good at that. I think and we talked about this a little bit last week, maintains good backfield vision. Like I think I mentioned it, half a helmet, to where he has this half, he's in front of his offensive lineman, but the other eye, he can always watch the QB and watch the ball. Does a really good job of that at his size, which is rare to see. And I think he has active hands. Like he tries to fight through it, but I think he's still refining that technique. As far as where I had him on my board, 29, so just ahead of Derek Harmon. And it's because of his rare movement and size. Like you don't find that a ton in the NFL. I think Harmon's biggest plus was that he's useful, right? The versatility lends himself to playing on almost every scheme. Whereas Grant, you're going to kind of need him to be the nose tackle in your scheme. And I think he's the best nose tackle in the class. And I think he has a really high ceiling, but there's still teams that run even fronts where you're never going to use a nose tackle. Ejiro Avero's defense, and while we didn't have a nose tackle and that was part of it, sometimes it didn't use one, right? Like we can throw Derek Brown at the nose tackle and stuff like that. So I think Grant's spots are more limited than Harmon's were, where like Harmon, I think Cincinnati would be a good fit and the Chargers would be a good fit. I think Grant could be a good fit on the Chargers as well. You know, the familiarity with Harbaugh and Jesse Mentor, but you're going to have to be more selective if you're Kenneth Grant, but the teams are going to have to be more selective based on how he can fit into the scheme. as opposed to Harmon, who, while he doesn't provide as much physical upside, he fits into every scheme. I kind of wanted to loop those two together because I have them so similar on my board in terms of ranking. I think I gave them the same exact grade as well. They just ended up slightly different on the number scale. But two really good players, and I think both of them will go in the first round. I think all four guys we talked about will end up taken on Thursday.
I know you just used the analogy between kind of Kenneth Grant here and Derek Harmon, but I want to make one between kind of Walter Nolan and Kenneth Grant here. And that's where, with Walter Nolan's ability, you expect more of the splash plays, and you get a little frustrated when you don't see those. And with Kenneth Grant, he has the power and the length to disperse these double teams. And you watch enough film, you're supposed to anticipate some of these blockers coming across so that you can blow them up, not the other way around. And he has all those tools. It's just a matter of him putting it together at the next level. And I think he needs to be put in a situation where he's not asked to do too much, and he's surrounded with better dudes. And what I mean by that is I would love, where we talked about the Raiders being a potential landing spot for Mason Graham, I think he would be great next to Christian Wilkins and Max Crosby. Like that's perfect for him, because at that point he can learn the position, and he wasn't able to take that double team. Christian Wilkins can handle that as a veteran, and then you address that in film and you get better and you learn how to do that. And you aren't punished for it on Sundays as much because other guys are able to kind of offset those limitations. So that's kind of where I see Derek Harmon. This is or not Derek Harmon, Kenneth Grant. And so the biggest thing is just allowing that power and length to show itself more frequently. So this kind of like frustration of he's got all the tools. It's not always equating to the result you want each and every play.
Right. And I think how I started my monologue there, right, is this first season starting. I think more and more reps and consistent reps will help him unlock that. And being in an NFL program where you're being coached and developed, right? You don't necessarily get that at the college level. Although I will say over the past half decade or so, nobody's done D-line better than Michigan. Maybe that'll change because they've lost their strength coaches and their actual coordinators to the NFL, but we'll have to see there. Those are like my four main, I think they're going on day one, guys. My fifth defensive lineman, who's also a nose tackle, is Alfred Collins. I think when you're looking at Collins, he knows how to command and eat up the double teams, right? He was a big reason why Texas 2 years ago was able to deploy the guy that the Seahawks drafted, Byron Murphy, at a very high level, and Tyvondre Sweat. Like, we talk about those two guys being the guys that year Texas went to the college football playoff, but Collins was a useful rotation player as well. He's kind of the last part of that really strong defensive line. I think he can be versatile despite his size. Like, they played him at the 3 tech, and he was an effective mover at that spot. Active hands and arms, really like lock up offensive linemen. And like Kenneth Grant, he does the half helmet. Like, he does a really good job keeping his eye in the backfield. Because I do strengths and weaknesses bullet points, I wrote, is he really a run stopper? ? And what I meant by that was he eats up the double spaces. He kind of muddies up the lanes, but when a running back gets into his assignment, he doesn't necessarily always bring him down, which is something you saw out of the four previous guys, like, pretty consistently. That would be my question for Collins going to the next level. Can he be more of a consistent tackler, finisher in the run game? But I think just technically and standing, holding up double teams, being a good penetrator with his size and the versatility that someone his size can bring, I think is quite rare. And I just looked, he was actually player 50 for me. So my final top 50 player is Alfred Collins. I think he'll go early day 2, and he'll be useful to a lot of teams. I don't think he's boxed into the pure nose in the same way that Kenneth Grant is.
No, I think he has a little bit more versatility. I think if anybody would kind of get lumped into being that nose, that would be considered maybe a top 100 prospect. And I'm not exactly sold on him. I think a lot of people are just sold on the measurables. Is Deion Walker out of Kentucky. Yeah. I think that guy is a space eater, compares very much to a Jordan Davis from like a size standpoint. And then I think that just gets in a conversation when you are that big and you don't necessarily have a lot of explosiveness in the case of a Deion Walker. It's like, how much do you offer outside of just being a guy that's taking up space? And so that value, this is again why I think when I started not the segment, but the podcast off with talking about like game wreckers, like outside of a Dexter Lawrence, maybe a Vita Vea, there are very few nose tackles that are really impacting the game or have even historically. So again, if you're looking for game wreckers, I don't think it's going to be these bigger size guys. I think they serve a specific role. And if you're taking them day 2, day 3, I think that's where the value lends itself. When you start looking at these guys with a higher draft pick, they need to offer a little bit more than just taking up space.
For sure. And Deion Walker is interesting. Coming into the this college football season and draft cycle, he was a pretty consistent top 15 to top 20 guy. And the size was a part of it. He's 6'7". Let me look at 331 pounds. Like, he's a Goliath human. You said Jordan Carter. I think he's closer to
Jordan Davis.
Or Jordan Davis,
Yeah.
excuse me. I think he's closer to Dontari Poe size, like that big of a person.
Yeah.
Not as good a mover as Poe was, because you got to remember Dontari Poe is a 15th or 16th overall pick when he was taken. Deion Walker or I guess 2 seasons ago now in 2023, 7.5 sacks from the nose tackle position, which is incredible. 13 tackles for loss, 28 total tackles. All of those numbers were cut in half or more than half this past season. He went to 13 total tackles, 5 tackles for loss, and 1.5 sacks. So a pretty big regression from 2 years ago. That's a big reason why he's been knocked down the draft board. I think if you watch his combine drills too, you'll see just how stiff he is, but that's understandable, right? A guy who's 6 foot, I just looked 6'7.5". I don't mean to knock off that half inch there for him. And 331 pounds is a Goliath human being, a titan of a person. And he's certainly going to be a good space eater, but if he continues in the track of the regression from last year, you might not get much more out of him. But if you need that kind of guy, right? Maybe he can be like a fullback on goal line downs or something like that. I think Deion Walker's the way to go. And it's funny that we talk about having a defensive lineman as a fullback. Ole Miss, I know we just talked about Walter Nolan, but they have a guy named JJ Pegues who is a little bit on the bigger side. He could fit the nose tackle profile, but they also used him as a fullback on like 20 different carries this past season. So if there's a gadget guy in the class like that, it'll be him. But as far as Deion Walker goes, yeah, really big, good size, good pass production. If you can draw that out of him, there's probably not a single one-on-one matchup in the league that he won't win. But you're going to have to be able to extract that high level out of him. And just based on 2024, it may not be there anymore.
Yeah. And I would prefer a guy from obviously a smaller school, face smaller competition. I think really showed out in the Senior Bowl, but that's Darius Alexander out of Toledo. We saw Quinyon Mitchell come out of Toledo, perform just fine at the NFL level. So I don't think the competition is as big a knock. This is a guy who wrecked a lot of havoc. Like I said, showed out big in the Senior Bowl. I think is going to offer a lot of upside as a 3 tech at the next level. Any thoughts on him as a prospect? What are your kind of biggest takeaways with somebody like him?
So I only had 3 games with Darius Alexander. I think he's pretty violent as a rusher, and he commands, helps double teams. I think his bull rush is his best way of attack. One of the things I wrote was he needs to work on his technique, particularly the use of his arms. If the defender wins initially, Alexander gets locked down. So what that means is he'll have to develop counters and stuff like that, but that's more projectable, and you have higher hope for that than somebody like Deion Walker being stiff, right? Like I think you can learn technique more than you can learn movement ability. And that lends himself to being a higher prospect. I think he's top 100 on consensus. Darius Alexander, that is. I know a lot of the professional draft evaluators are a lot higher on him than I was. And again, they definitely have access to more information on him. So good player. I would assume he goes in the first, definitely not day 1, but definitely on day 2. Like, he'll be a top 100 pick, I would assume. And then there's a lot of people in that group, like TJ Sanders, Tyleek Williams, Joshua Farmer is another one from Florida State. There are a lot of, I think, useful day 2 defensive tackles. I just think, like you're saying, the cream of the crop really falls off after Derek Harmon and Kenneth Graham.
And that's what leads into the conversation about the Panthers offseason. What do we do at 8? And then obviously the subsequent picks, because we went on and on last week. I mean, the podcast, I think, was like an hour and a half, us talking about edges. And here we're kind of wrapping up with the prospects. And when we look at the guys the Panthers added this offseason, just to the defensive line in general, edge and defensive tackle positions, you see the Bobby Brown signing as depth for A'Shawn Robinson playing that nose tackle. DJ Wanham, he looks like he's back and healthy. Him and Clowney should be kind of your bigger rotation pieces there. DJ Johnson's in there. You signed Patrick Jones to add depth on the defensive tackle. You also go out and get Tershawn Wharton. And so I think this kind of like lends itself to what do we need the most help at right now? Because our outside linebacker rotation consists of, like I said, Jadeveon Clowney, DJ Wanham, Patrick Jones, DJ Johnson, guys that are 6'4", 6'5", 260 pounds. And then in interior wise, you got Derek Brown coming back from injury. You just signed Tershawn Wharton, A'Shawn Robinson, Bobby Brown, and Shai Tuttle. So, like, what needs more help to kind of get over the top? What do you think makes sense? Because I think both positions are going to get addressed in the draft. It's just a matter of when and where.
Well, we said it on Thursday. It's obviously the edge rusher room, the outside linebacker room, if you will, in this scheme. I think you feel quite good about the top 3 or 4 interior guys, right? Derek Brown's a Pro Bowler. He'll be fresh, like a year off of playing. I know we often think about injuries as, he's missed a year. He's also not taken a year of hits, right? So he's going to be a little more juiced when he gets back. A'Shawn Robinson doesn't have to be the number 1 defensive tackle on the team anymore. And I thought he had a good second half to the season, particularly in games like the Giants game, the first Tampa Bay game. I thought he was quite good. Shai Tuttle took a pay cut. He doesn't have to start anymore, right? And then you bring in Bobby Brown, a real nose tackle, the first real nose tackle that Everos had since he's been here, familiarity with the scheme, and Tershawn Wharton, who is like the discount Milton Williams, who should be able to provide some edge rushing help, or not edge rushing help, some 3-tech help alongside Derek Brown and Bobby Brown, who I would assume starts. Then you look at the edge rushers, right? Clowney, I think he had an admirable year for someone of his age, right? DJ Wanham missed half the year. When he came back, he looked decent. And then Patrick Jones, we just signed. He came off a career year of 7 sacks, but that's not a lot of backfield production. I'm not even going to talk about DJ Johnson as a pass rusher, although I think he did improve in the run game, which is why he was drafted. But I really don't think he should be a top 3 to 4 rotation guy. So it's really the edge rusher room. I think that's quite clear. If Mason Graham falls to that 8th pick, I don't see how you can turn him away just because of the talent level and the ceiling raising ability he could bring next to a nose tackle and next to Derek Brown, who's already he's not the backfield disruptor. He's the run game canceller. Imagine adding him next to Mason Graham. It'd be cinema, as what's his name? The old director says in the meme there. But edge rusher is obviously the one that needs the help. I know we're talking about D tackles today, but if I had to make a guess, I think I actually made the guess on my Purrfect Take last week. It's going to be an edge rusher in round 1.
Yeah. And talking about this, it's not that edge is necessarily the wrong choice. I think when we go to projecting and not only talking about, okay, what's the best option in the first round, what's the best option when you look in the second and third round? So maybe the best way to phrase this is, would you want a guy like Walter Nolan? And at 57, I do think, because we see guys fall all the time, whether it's a Princely Umanmielen, Braden Swinson out of LSU, or maybe even a James Pierce out of Tennessee, who really has the talent of a first-round player, but has a lot of off-field issues that turn people off. Would you want that kind of 1-2 punch right there? Or would you want to go Mikael Williams? And then at that point, like we aren't really like, I would say bringing in anybody for 30 visits didn't really have a lot of pro day visits in terms of defensive line prospects until like a Deion Walker day 3. So it seems like the team itself sees like, okay, there's this cream of defensive tackle prospects, but then they have like almost like an edge prospect, 2 or 3 for each subsequent round. And so it just seems like, okay, if you're sold on a Tet McMillan, a Walter Nolan, it seems like you don't get a player like that afterwards. Now, granted, if I'm going about this draft, I personally would go Walter Nolan in the first, get your wide receiver in the second, and get your edge in the 3rd and 4th round, maybe even take another stab in day 3 and just hope one of those guys hits. And that's just for me of going, okay, talent-wise, based on position, where are some of these thresholds? And I feel like for defensive tackle, wide receiver, 2 that are really big and pressing for the Carolina Panthers, it drops off after, I want to say, the first 50, 75 guys.
For sure. I think receivers a little bit deeper, but the defensive tackle for sure. You pose the scenario, like if it would be Walter Nolan and let's say Princely, the 2 Ole Miss teammates, I would probably prefer that to Michael Williams and let's say I don't know, TJ or Joshua Farmer at 57.
Yeah,
but you bring up a good point because you brought up Tet McMillan and the wide receivers. I don't think you could say defensive tackle is the top 2 or even 3 pressing need because again, we still only have like one NFL caliber safety. Starting caliber safety, I should say, on the roster. I think tight end is also a need for the team. They mentioned in the Dan Morgan presser today, Ike Ekwonu's 5th-year option in the future of Taylor Moton. So tackle could be something that the team looks offensive tackle, I should say, could be something that the team looks at. And I do think they do want to add defensive line depth in the interior. But like you said, they brought in, other than Nolan, they brought in Cam Jackson from Florida, who's going to go day 3. Deion Walker, who's if he's not at the end of day 2, he'll go day 3, and Warren Brinson from Georgia, who's going to go day 3. But then the edge rusher group you talked about, they brought in Shamar Stewart, Donovan Ezuraku, Princely, Braden Swinson, Ashton Galote, Q Robinson, Jordan Birch, and Femi Oladeo. So 8 edge rushers they brought in. And they had Jalen Walker here for his local because he's from Salisbury. And they reportedly had big interest in Michael Williams and Princely at their pro days. It's pretty clear they're targeting edge. And that's where I kind of have the idea or the intuition that edge is going to be the more pressing need addressed early in the draft than defensive tackle would. I don't necessarily agree from a talent or like a level of talent standpoint, like you're talking about. I think Walter Nolan and Mason Graham, for that matter, are much better prospects than somebody like Shamar Stewart or Donovan Ezuraku, people we've brought in. But yeah, I really think that they're going to focus on edge rusher in round 1. Last year, the Panthers telegraphed their movements, and by all reporting, their interest has been locked in on edge rushers, particularly the 2 Georgia edge rushers. So it would really surprise me if round 1 is not an edge rusher.
When we do the Panther mock drafts next week, we're going to do the version of what we think the Panthers front office is going to do and what we'd like to do. Mm-hmm. If you had the option, I understand exactly what you said. When we talked about edge rushers, I do think they're going Mikel Williams at 8. Like everything I think really does point to that pick if a Mason Graham doesn't fall. But if you really had to choose between those 2, like you said, like I think you're taking the Walter Nolan, Princely, Uman Milan, and Mikel Williams, and if it's another edge rusher or wide receiver, whatever that pairing is, just because, again, I think the talent and the value you're getting from those picks, it's not like you're disregarding the edge position. You just go, okay, this is a deep group. There's not a lot of separation between, and I'm not trying to be mean to Mikel Williams, Shamar Stewart, Donovan Ezuraku, Mike Green, but like that group is still not that far apart from some of these other guys like Princely, Uman Milan, James Pierce, who I think really should have been discussed there, Braden Swinson at LSU. Like that gap is not as big, and that's where I feel like you can still get value a little bit later. So again,
that's true. That's true. I agree. When we talk about what we would do, I think it would be a prudent exercise to knock out who we think the first 7 picks will be. And that'll help make that easier because in my position, if Mason Graham falls, I'm going to take him, but I just don't think that's reasonable, right? And while I think Michael Williams is like my 14th player or something on my board, Walter Nolan's my 5th, right? And like you're saying, the gap from Nolan to, let's just say, TJ Sanders from South Carolina, local guy, is going to be bigger than the gap from Michael Williams to Braden Swinson or Princely. I understand the point you're trying to make. To me, they're like drafting for need is always a big part of it. Like teams are like, oh, we're going to draft best player available. Yeah, that fits your needs. And to me, I think that the edge is more of a pressing need than defensive tackle. I think they're going to take 2 edge rushers. Maybe that should be like an extra perfect take for me today. They're going to take more than 1 edge rusher in the class. I think that's going to rear its head on Thursday when we are watching the draft. And I think it will be an edge rusher. But I wouldn't be mad if it's Walter Nolan. I think that's a good way to cycle back to the defense tackles.
Well, it's not that it's mad. It's just I think this is genuinely, and I sent you this in a message, but this was a discussion that was had on The Athletic. But when you look at different ways to kind of put together a production score based on just actual production, like tackles for losses, sacks, and you find a good way to weight them, 90th percentile production score from the defensive tackle, and you look at it for guys drafted in the first 2 rounds over the past decade that meet this criteria that Walter Nolan's in, you have Live on
Onwuzurike.
Onwuzurike with the Tennessee Titans. You have Braden Fisk, who was a great pick by the Rams last year. Dexter Lawrence with the Giants. He's an all-pro. Vita Vea, who we've already mentioned on the show. Jalen Carter, who's a massive difference maker. Jeffrey Simmons. Kalijah Cansey. Chris Wormley is really the only backup that I've said so far. Kobe Turner. Christian Barmore. Jonathan Allen. Quinyon Williams. And that's it. Like those are stars. And so to me, this like whole banking on, oh, what could Mikael Williams or Shamar Stewart be? Or maybe some of these undersized guys that are productive, like a Jalen Walker or Donovan Ezeuruke. Like, why aren't you just taking Walter Nolan, the best player available? You had a bad defensive line. Some of these guys that are filling stopgags in the defensive line, in that interior, like those guys are only around for another year or two. Get a rookie that can learn from some of these guys, from veterans in the room, and be a superstar for when you are in the playoffs consistently with Bryce Young and this young core and this offensive line. Like, to me, it's just like you're gambling too much because it's the safe or more valuable position. What did Christian Wilkins just get paid? What's Jalen Carter going to get paid? I mean, Chris Jones is a $30 million guy. Like, again, it's just sometimes you overthink this by going, okay, well, positional value, and this is a need, and this is a deep class. You can take stabs at guys the rest of the draft class. You're visiting with those guys for that exact scenario. Like, actually do it and take the best player and make your team better.
No, I'm with you. I don't know if you think I'm disagreeing with you, because
I'm not. I'm
okay.
upset with Dan Morgan, and I think this needs to be more the discourse, because the Panthers Nation is going at each other's throats over Mikael Williams and Jalen Walker. Like, I'm alone in this, and I think you're with it and me here too. But we are of a small group that believes Walter Nolan's a better player. Like, he's just a better player than those two guys.
Jalen Walker for sure. I've voiced my concerns about him, and I think Nolan's upside is there as well. But for me, and I'm probably higher, I'm definitely higher on Mikael Williams than you are. He's a top 15 player for me, Mikael Williams. So I don't have as big a hesitation taking him at 8 as opposed to Nolan. If it came to Jalen Walker, I would be disappointed. I think they have a vision for him, but to me, a top 10 pick just can't fall outside certain physical thresholds. And I think the counter is going to be, well, Bryce Young fell outside those thresholds. Bryce Young's job is to throw the football to people. And at the end of this year, he showed he could do that at a pretty high level. Jalen Walker's job is going to be to get around 300 plus pounds athletic offensive tackles who are more athletic than he is. And I think that's going to be a more difficult thing in the league. Another person in the same vein, Jedi Barron is being brought up as like a top 10 pick now. I have the same concerns there, right? This is a 5'11" guy who's I was looking at it earlier. If you give me just a second, he is in the 3rd percentile arm length, 15th percentile wingspan, 23rd in height. Did I already say hand size? No, he has small hands too. That's Jedi Barron. And like, that's why I have issues with him in the top 10. Those are my issues with Jalen Walker. But when it gets down to Nolan versus Mikael Williams, I would really be happy with either of them. But I understand what the sentiment you're trying to say. Get the fronts we can deploy and rotate, like in the Super Bowl. People think about KK Short and Star Lotulelei. Kyle Love that year and Coney Ely were eating, right? Some of the edge rushers were eating that year, and it's because they could rotate and be fresh. And if you get a Walter Nolan or a Mason Graham, you can bring that back to the team, who, again, was the worst defense of all time. So I will not be mad if that's the pick there.
And let me bring this back. So I think, drafted Derek Brown after obviously failing with the Vernon Butler situation. I think KK Short was still on the team. It was a very, like, it was a need, but I wouldn't say it was like the super pressing need. Now, granted, like, I don't know necessarily the discourse around that time that exactly put my stamp that it wasn't like a top 3 need.
It was, but left tackle was still a top need. Then
exactly, and that's where it was. It wasn't the first thing, but it was like up there.
Well, yeah, it was up there too.
Absolutely, and that's why it was like Justin Herbert, Derek Brown, the pick there. Obviously, Herbert got taken before, but then you even go back a little bit further before that, and the Luke Kuechly pick. Like, we had John Beast and Thomas Davis, and everybody was like, we're fine at this position. What happened? Some of those guys got injured, and Luke Kuechly was an all-star. Like, if you have the ability, and I'm not saying Walter Nolan's going to be the Luke Kuechly of his position. I'm just saying the flashes are there to where this is a guy that really does have Pro Bowl capabilities. And I just feel like when you miss out on him and the team that grabs him in the teens, especially when one of those teams could be a division rival, like if this is like my worst nightmare is like a Mike Green, Walter Nolan, who I think will be really good at the next level, landing in a situation like that where we face him twice a year. And it's like, you could have had that guy and you missed on him because you overthought it, because you're trying to do the smart or the edge, take your edge and try to, or take your process and find the edge. Words and phrases are just not my thing. But that kind of concept where it's just, I don't feel like Mikael Williams, it's not based on what he's done so far. It's based on what he could be, which we've seen those guys pan out. Trayvon Walker is not a bad player at the NFL level, but do you want a guy like Trayvon Walker, or do you want a disruptive presence in the interior like a Jeffrey Simmons, Jalen Carter? And that's what I think it comes down to.
It's just going to come down to that. I think it's a lot of projecting to say that Walter Nolan can become Jalen Carter or Simmons. I know the level of production, and I think that's on a per snap basis, the thing you looked at. I listened to the same show that you did where you pulled that there. Shout out Fran Duffy, who came
Fran
up
Duffy's
with that production
phenomenal.
score. Yeah. I get you there. And I don't want to say our D-line's a strength yet because we haven't seen it, but keeping a strength strong or strengthening it in itself is usually a good process. So I'm not going to be mad with Walter Nolan or Mikael Williams for that matter. I think you might be a little mad, but we'll get into Purrfect Takes here to end the prospect overview podcast series before we get to the draft. And I kind of mentioned it earlier. I think 4 defensive linemen are going to go day one. Interior defensive linemen. I don't want to cheapen it and like not include that and say, oh, Mikael Williams is defensive lineman. No, it's going to be 4 interior guys that go on day one. It's going to be the first 4 we talked about. So Mason Graham, Walter Nolan, Derek Harmon, and Kenneth Grant. Maybe in that order, we'll all go on day one. That's what it's going to be. Mason Graham's going first. And then it's going to be whatever team picks what they want after that. But all 4 will go on day one.
Okay. I like that take. I think that's a given that those 4 will go. What I am going to say is because why I would personally love to see Derek Harmon fall to the Chargers. I think he's gone before them. And I think they reconnect, or Jesse Minter and Jim Harbaugh reconnect with their boy Kenneth Grant from Michigan. I think having a guy like that can be a space eater will help them rebuild the defensive line and instill kind of the culture they are attempting to build out in Los Angeles. So I think them building through the trenches makes a lot of sense. The connection there makes a lot of sense. And because I don't think he offers near the upside of the other 3 techs, he'll be there for them and still be a very valuable pick. I could still see the Chargers going wide receiver, but that's my take. I think Kenneth Grant and Jesse Minter reunite going in the 2025.
I like that one. I think there's been a lot of smoke about Derek Harmon to the Bengals at 17. So I could see it playing out exactly in the way you're laying it out. That's going to do it for us. I think I mentioned it last week. If not, I'm not going to be here Thursday, taking a vacation with my family to the beach. I don't think Steve's going to be here. He's taking a much needed break from the pod for like a week, and then we'll be back on Tuesday. Tuesday, I think we'll do Panther mock, and then Thursday, the day of the draft, we'll do our final what we think will happen 32 pick draft. And I think that's how we'll lay it out. We might switch the 2 days, who knows? But until then, stay tuned for the mock drafts and keep pounding.